The process of emancipation, I indicated, was prolonged and complex, and in the end completed about 1917. And that leads me to my own family history. My grandfather, my maternal grandfather, who forms the subject of about half of this book, I guess, was the first generation in our family to live as an emancipated Jew, because his mother had come from Kovna in Lithuania, which was under Tsarist control, where Jews were forced to live, forced to live in the Pale and subject to a wide variety of legal and economic restrictions. He was born, my grandfather was born in America, so he grew up technically and legally as a full and equal citizen of the United States. But of course, that wasn't the end of the story. Jewishness did not disappear as a difficult issue in the lives of people, obviously in the 20s and 30s, where they faced mass anti-Semitism. And I got heavily into studying my grandfather's history because I inherited from my mother a big box of his papers. And he was a would-be author, he was a journalist, he was a political activist. He lived in New York, particularly in the Bronx, in the first half of the 20th century. He was born about 1900. And throughout the 20s, 30s, 40s, he was a left-wing activist. He was pro-labor, anti-racist, very strongly anti-racist, not only anti-Semitic, anti-racist in general, and in particular, he felt very strongly about racism against African Americans, which he correctly understood to be the fundamental problem in the United States. And he used to say that, as far as in the 30s, he used to say that as far as he was concerned, any Jew who discriminated against a Negro deserved everything Hitler was promising for them. Now that's pretty tasteless, and that gives you a flavor of my grandfather's flair for overstatement. But he wasn't alone in making these kind of statements in the 30s, and he did feel very strongly that human freedom, human equality were not divisible, and that the Jews would win their freedom and their full equality and defeat anti-Semitism as part of a broad alliance with other groups who were seeking social justice. And so he became a leftist. He was never a member of the Communist Party, though he worked very closely with the Communist Party. He disliked what he considered to be party line regimentation, but I also think he was just a bit afraid of the practical consequences of joining the Communist Party in New York in the 30s and 40s. But nonetheless, as I said, he worked with them. And in particular, he was for a long time an opponent of imperial wars. He was an opponent of the British Empire and a supporter of both the Irish and the Indian independence struggles. Excuse me. And strong supporter, as I said, of labor rights, civil liberties. He wanted to see a welfare state in America. In 1946, he ran for Congress on the American Labor Party ticket. And yes, there was once an American Labor Party. And between 1936 and 1948, in New York exclusively, it was a very significant political power, routinely getting 20% of the vote in New York, and something of a power broker, independent of the Democratic Party. It was probably the most successful left-wing third party in the United States history since the old socialists before World War I. And the American Labor Party in New York was a coalition, I should explain, of the Communist Party, of the Jewish-dominated garment workers, textile workers unions, and of independent progressive activists and intellectuals like my grandfather. So in 1946, as I said, he ran for Congress, and I still have his campaign bill, his leaflet, stuck, framed, and put up above my desk where I work, sort of to remind me, I guess, of where I'm coming from. And I guess it's sad that most of what he was campaigning for, we are still campaigning for today, both in the United States and Britain. In the United States, they're still campaigning, as he was, for a national health service, still campaigning for affordable housing, for an increased minimum wage, for trade union rights, for nuclear disarmament, for friendship with the Soviet Union and all the nations of the world, for non-imperial foreign policy, anti-discrimination legislation, all fantastic stuff, and all stuff that would appear on any left-wing manifesto today. But there's one thing on his manifesto that would not appear on a left-wing manifesto today, and that is the support for a Jewish state in Palestine. He had become interested in Zionism in the late 30s, but he only very gradually took it seriously, and in that, he's pretty typical of his age. It's after the war, after the revelations of the Holocaust, that he becomes seriously committed to what he sees as the necessity of building a Jewish state in Palestine, and he believes the principal obstacles to that are not the Palestinians, who have no existence in his mind, but the British, who, of course, as the mandate power, are physically in control, or at least formally in control of Palestine. And he blames all the obstacles, all the resistance to a Jewish state on the British, which makes it easy for him as an anti-imperialist. He can therefore reconcile, or thereby reconcile, his support for a Jewish state with his opposition to imperialism. It's not a position that is coherent, and history has shown that he was profoundly wrong. But he wasn't alone in seeing it this way in 46 and even more in 48. In 48, in his columns in the Jewish Review, which was a fairly widely circulated newspaper in the Bronx, and which he wrote a weekly column for, and he was the deputy editor of, it's all throughout, this is 60 years ago today, it is week after week of positively bloodthirsty celebration of the foundation of the Jewish state, with a kind of militarism that he himself had never displayed before in his life. He was always, even in World War II, he was very correctly, very wary of the values of militarism and patriotism and blood and soil nationalism. And suddenly in 48, all those inhibitions go away, and all that's left is his desire for the Jews to be militarily successful, because that had become an extension of his own needs for a clear identity and a strong identity. And in the process of this, he completely denies the existence of the indigenous people of Palestine.